What's up, everyone? How's it going? Today, I'm going to be talking to you real quick just about how to make a fairly straightforward hide and show toggle, how to make it accessible through the use of a couple of ARIA attributes, use CSS to kind of handle the styles of the hide and show toggle itself. Yeah, let's just jump right into it. You'll see on the screen here, I have set up just a pretty straightforward, relatively basic structure for what we'll be doing today. In the visual side of things, we have just this nice little content area, which is the content that we're going to toggle the hide and show of. And then I have a button here that is just going to be the controller for how we hide and show this content. So let's kind of run over just some of the basic ARIA bits that I have in here right now. By default, there are a couple of things that we need to address here when we hide and show content. For screen reader purposes, we need to make sure that we're telling the screen readers what content is visible and what should be read by that screen reader. And if we're taking an action to hide or show that content, we need to alert the screen reader of that as well. So the first step in doing that is here on line 19. By default, what I want out of this little example here, by default, I want our content to be hidden. So as soon as you show up on the page, this method can be used for accordions, for just kind of like little read more sections where you're just hiding and showing single pieces of content, or like I said, accordions where you're handling multiple pieces of content. The multiple piece of it, if you were doing an accordion, will be a little bit more complex, as you would have to kind of loop through all of the DOM nodes on the page and just write a little bit of extra JavaScript for that. For now, just for brevity here, we'll be proceeding as if we only had one area on the page where we wanted to hide and show content. So back to the ARIA hidden bit. By default, I'm setting ARIA hidden to true here, as you can see. That just means that I want my content, as soon as someone lands on the page, to be hidden by default. This ARIA hidden value can be paired with some CSS to make things ultra certain that on any screen reader that content never gets read. Screen readers do tend to behave pretty erratically as you jump between various programs. So each screen reader has its own set of quirks. So a lot of times, all that you need to do is within your CSS, I'm targeting our toggle content area, which is just a class name on our div that also has the ARIA hidden attribute. Most of the time, what you can do is just set that div or whatever you're targeting to display none. And that'll generally be good enough for most screen readers. But for whatever reason, there are screen readers out there that will sometimes read content that is set to display none by default. So pairing this display none with a default ARIA hidden set to true is just a good safety net to make sure that you're covering all of your bases to ensure that the experience across different screen readers is consistent. So that's the purpose of that. Just this ARIA hidden attribute is just telling the screen readers that the content within this div that is wrapping the H1 in the paragraph that we have here does not need to be read until this is switched. Another thing that we need to do is on line 16 here, you'll see I have an ARIA controls attribute. And essentially what this controls attribute does is it lets the screen reader know that, hey, this button triggers an action that affects this div. And the way that we link those two things together is through this ARIA controls attribute and an ID on the thing that is actually being toggled. So this ID is purely, I'm not using it in the CSS or the JavaScript for anything at all. It's purely just to link the ARIA controls attribute to the toggle content div to make sure that there's a link between the two and alert the screen reader that these two things affect each other. Or rather that the button directly affects the toggle content area. It's a one-way relationship there. So yeah, that is pretty much all that needs to be done in the HTML. We've defined all the defaults that we need. We've linked the button and the content area. So now we can kind of get into the JavaScript that'll actually toggle the hide and show. This is just all default, so I'll get rid of that. So the first thing that we want to do is probably set up a few variables, right? So we want to, just for the record as well, I'm going to be using ES6. ES6 is super well supported in all modern browsers right now. It's a very nice way to write JavaScript, very concise, keeps things nice and clean. So I'll be using ES6. If there's, I'll try to explain the terms as best I can as I go through them. So instead of variables, we're going to be using consts. Const because these elements will not change; they're not mutable. Const is just like the default that you reach for until you need to change something, in which case you would use let. So for now, I'll set up a few const variables. One for the button. And we'll just do a query selector on the document. So document.query selector. What was the class name on that? Toggle content. Or sorry, no, toggle button. I'm using query selector here because we only have one instance of toggle button. As I was mentioning, if you did leverage this for some sort of accordion or something like that, you'd likely need to reach for the query selector all. Which would then grab every single instance of toggle button in the document and then loop over those to actually fire actions and stuff. But just because we only have one instance on the page here, I'm just using a basic query selector toggle button. This will only ever get the first instance of this selector that you pass to it. So yeah, just be careful to use query selector only when you know there's going to be one instance of that element on the page. So we have that. Let's also set a const for the content area. Same deal, we'll just do document, query selector. And this is just toggle content. That should be basically all we need. We can get any of the attributes and whatnot from the content area elsewhere. The next step here is going to be actually adding some action to the button. So let's add an event listener so that every time you click on the button, stuff happens. So we'll do button dot add event listener. And the first parameter here, we're going to tell it that every time we click it, that's the action we want to listen, or the event that we want to listen for. Every time you click, run a function, and I'm just using a basic arrow function here. Again, another ES6 deal, couple parentheses, fat arrow function there. Just to kind of get a sense of where we're at here, let's just console log clicked. Super basic. Let me open up the console. The console here is going to be really small, so you should see something move down here. It says clicked, gives us indication that our event listener is firing properly, and we can proceed. I generally am fairly verbose in how I work. I like to make sure that every step of the way things are working the way that they should, so that when I run into a problem inevitably, I can kind of step backwards and fix it. So just kind of just how I work. I like to console log stuff a lot to make sure that things are behaving the way that I intended them to. Cool. So we have our event listener working here. That is good. Let's start to actually write some function behind here. One of the things that we will want to do to kind of keep this super dynamic is get the state of the content that we're toggling, right? We can do that by checking the value of the ARIA hidden attribute as soon as we click on the button. So let's set a constant variable for that. We'll call this just ARIA hidden because we're going to be getting the ARIA hidden attribute off of the content element. So ARIA hidden equals content.get attribute ARIA hidden. So we're essentially telling this method, hey, grab the value of the ARIA hidden attribute on the content div that we queried up here. One thing to note, so because we have defined this constant outside of the scope of this function, every single time we click on the button right now, this variable is going to return true because by default we have set the content area to ARIA hidden true. So what we want to do is move this then. We want to move the content into the button, into the event listener that happens as soon as we click on the button, so that every single time we click on the button, we requery essentially the DOM and get the most up-to-date state of that content div. I feel like I'm talking a little bit in React terms, but that's just where my mind's going here right now. So every time we click on this button, we essentially requery and get the current state of the content div. So what we can do from here then is leverage that value to dictate how we want the content area to behave. So the first step in that then would be to let's essentially toggle the ARIA hidden attribute value. The way we can do that is by letting or setting on the content an attribute, so set attribute. So we're essentially overriding the value of the attribute for ARIA hidden. So this method essentially takes two parameters. The first parameter is the attribute that we want to change, and then the second parameter is the actual value of that attribute. So within here, what we can do is write a ternary operator that essentially checks to see, okay, if the ARIA hidden value on the content is true, we want to set the value to false. So we're checking the current state of the content and setting it to the opposite to initiate the toggle. So what we'll do here then is set this ARIA hidden. We're going to check this value and see if it is equal to true. And again, this returns the get attribute method returns a string. So we want to make sure we're comparing a string. So we check to see is ARIA hidden true. If it is, then we're going to set the attribute to false. Otherwise, we want to set it back to true. So yeah, just a nice little ternary operator there to check the value and then set the value of ARIA hidden based on the return value from our initial get attribute. So let's go ahead and save that and refresh. Again, small console. I'll let you know what's happening here. Actually, instead of checking the console, let's actually check the HTML here. So I'm looking at the div that we have our toggle content class on. It by default has our ARIA hidden value set to true. If I click on this, ARIA hidden is set to false the first time. If I click on it again, it sets it back to true. So we're successfully toggling the ARIA hidden value on our div. And you'll notice obviously that the content isn't showing up. One way that we can do that, there's a couple of ways that we can handle this. We can do this through JavaScript. If you prefer to set styles inline on the element through JavaScript, you can certainly do it that way. Personally, I prefer to let this be handled either by a class or some sort of CSS to allow us to have a little bit more flexibility control over how this element behaves when it is visible. So one of the ways that we can do that is through an attribute selector within CSS. So if we target the toggle content div, and then also target the attribute on it that is ARIA hidden. If the ARIA hidden value is set to true, or rather false, if we're telling the content area to show, then what we can do instead of display none, we can set this to display block. I'll refresh this, and when I toggle, we should see a nice hide and show through our JavaScript. This just allows us, doing this through the CSS allows us to like mess around. If we wanted to change like background colors or like width and height or do something crazy with it, we can do that all through the CSS selector rather than having to individually define each property through the JavaScript. Makes it just a little bit easier. So great. So we have the basic functionality of our toggle completed. It's nice and accessible. It's using ARIA attributes to properly handle the change. Visually, however, you'll see as soon as we show the content, we likely want this button to, instead of say show content again, toggle to hide content so that when we click it, it gives a visual indication to the user what the action is actually going to do. So let's do that. We can use a relatively similar method of checking the ARIA attribute on the element and taking action based on that value. One thing to think through here, however, is at the time that we would be running this code, we have set the attribute on click of this button kind of after we've already cached the existing values for the ARIA hidden value and the content selector, right? So what we'll need to do is kind of wait until this set attribute happens and dictate what that text should say within this button based off of the result of this action that was taken. So after that attribute has been set, we can set another constant to kind of define the text that we want within the button. So I'll do const button text, and we're going to use another ternary operator here to determine the output of the text, whether we want it to say show or hide. By doing this, we don't want to use this ARIA hidden constant again, because like I said, this is cached and will not reflect the change that was made by our set attribute method here. So for brevity's sake, what we can do is just essentially query this attribute again. We don't want it to be cached because we want to get the most up-to-date information from this element here. So we will again do content get attribute ARIA hidden after this set attribute has been set. If the value of ARIA hidden is set to true, then we want the text within the button to say show, because this is indicating that the content is hidden. So we now want to show the content. If it's anything else, then we want it to say hide, indicating that the content is shown, and clicking the button will subsequently hide the content. This should give us, here, let me pull it up just a little bit more so it's all in one line. So this should give us a string that indicates whether the resulting action of clicking the button will either show or hide the content. This content bit is going to remain there the whole time. So we don't need to set this within the variable. We don't need to say show content, hide content. We can use what's called a template literal to handle the actual output of the inner HTML of the button. So we have this constant defined. From here, we can now set on the button the inner HTML to be this template literal. So the template literal in ES6 always starts with backticks. So we've got 2 backticks. Content is just going to, this essentially just lets us write a normal string, and then wherever we want within this string, we can inject some JavaScript, right? So within here, we can then do $ curly brackets. This essentially escapes us out back into the world of JavaScript and allows us to grab that constant that we set above button text. So this is going to output the string that is a result of the button text const, and then we just written a normal string called content. So on click, we're going to get the attribute again, dictate the content within the button based on that attribute, and then output that string into the inner HTML of the button. So by default, it's using what we have on the HTML side of things, which is show. As soon as we click, it changes to hide, shows the content, properly sets all the ARIA attributes. ARIA hidden is set to false. Hit it again. ARIA hidden is set to true. And it goes back to say show content. So that's a nice, relatively quick and painless way to get a toggle on your site. Nice and accessible, fairly dry as far as the code goes. There's probably ways to refactor out this redefining of the attribute, but I'll leave it to you to kind of explore that a little bit on your own. This should at least get you up and running, hopefully painlessly, and hopefully this helped a little bit. Let's check to see how this actually behaves in the screen reader. So I'll open this up in a new window and open up my screen reader, NVDA.
Okay, hello.
Nope, actually, you know what? Give me 1 second here.
Exit action.
Just make sure that. There we go.
Well, okay. OBS 64C, hello. Microsoft Edge Dev Profile 1. Hello. Button show content.
So the screen reader will begin by starting to read out the actual document. If I arrow down,
button show content.
It indicates that this is a button, that this has an action where you can show the content. If I try to down button into the content while it's not shown,
button show content,
you'll see that nothing happens at all. It just remains on the only focusable item on the page right now, which is this show content button. As soon as I hit return to initiate that action, I can hit the down arrow
heading
again,
level 1 will hide this.
and it starts to read the actual content within the content area. If I hit the up arrow back to the button,
hide content,
it indicates that we can actually hide the content. So we hit return, and it completes the action.
Note, logit.
Awesome. So that is about it, and that hopefully gives you a good idea of how to effectively add a nice accessible toggle to your site, one where screen readers can adequately understand what's going on and where hidden content on the page is not actually read by those screen readers. I appreciate you sticking around. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.